So, Paul, tell us a little bit about Galatea. For those who weren't here yesterday, maybe explain to us what the inspiration was and what the name means, and give us a little bit of an overview.
Okay, well, Galatea itself, it relates to a story from ancient Rome. And
Matt, can you turn up the volume, please?
Can you hear? Are we hearing? Okay. It may seem it's somewhat obscure, but it's a really interesting poem because it's about a sculptor, which is, of course, an important theme here, who creates a statue of a beautiful woman. And he is a very misogynistic guy who wants perfection, which, as we all know, is pretty well impossible for many of us, and we all have our conflicts and things like this. But he falls in love with his statue, and the goddess Aphrodite brings the statue to life. And the theme that was interesting to me was bringing something to life and the experience of consciousness. And if you hear the piece, even right at the beginning, I feel in myself there's a kind of almost like a prayer or a poem right at the beginning of the piece that is related to that feeling of just becoming aware for the first time. And one of the most important themes that I had for this thing, before I started with the Sculpture Park, I was thinking about energy and our physical energy being turned into music, which is a very powerful aspect of being a musician. You just feel your body creating these sounds, and those sound waves come directly from the energy of our body. And then there's this is all guided by our conscious beings are creating these sounds. So the sound of music is an expression of our consciousness. And then the third thing is that it's to connect with each other. And music is this extraordinary and powerful social experience that we do together. And in fact, as this project has developed, it's becoming more and more social in a really beautiful way that I'm really enjoying. I just wanted to say that. So for me, one of the things that happened, I also looked at a very interesting bit of scientific research, which shows that musical instruments in the part of the brain that actually creates music, that part of us has a very old consciousness. And that consciousness is very animistic, and we experience our musical instruments as if they are alive. And this can be shown by the fact that if somebody has a stroke in the left side of the brain, or a certain part of the brain, I'm actually not sure of the details, but it's basically if you cannot list living things, you cannot list musical instruments. So it means that musical instruments are completely connected together with what's alive in the world. This is not our conscious minds. This is something in our unconscious. But the fact that it's there is really very powerful. And when I was at the Sculpture Park, I spent a lot of time around the Series 1 sculptures. And what I loved about them was their beautiful sounds. And I spent a lot of time playing them and actually recording myself. And certain things became quite inspired inside of me that actually became part of the work itself, just by playing the instruments. They have it's interesting, I call the sculptures instruments. And so it's interesting that whole kind of, actually I've made that mistake quite a number of times. So for me, those sculptures come alive when I play them as musical instruments, so that connects to it. Now, there's another thing that's going to happen today that's really a world premiere, and we're going to do a second version of this composition, which is using instruments which are from Peru, and they are called whistling vessels. And I have created a version of the piece where there's a kind of turn-taking between the string quartet and the people who are playing the whistling vessels. Now, let me explain what these instruments are. They're copies made by somebody called Jose Vitancio Umeres, who lives in Cusco and in Peru, right up high up. And through the help of my friend Anna, who is here today, who is from Peru, we made contact with them. We ordered some of these instruments in. They are copies of instruments that were originally made 3,000 years ago, and there's something magical about them. They're sculptural in shape, which is part of that theme. And the question is, there's a sort of a shock when you see them. You use them, and suddenly they make the sound of a bird or an animal. And there's something in our sort of old part of our minds that's touched by this, the sort of the naive part of ourselves. And there's an example right there.
You can do that one more time?
Yeah. We've had to mic them today, but I actually think in a concert hall, which is very reverberant, they might actually be able to be played very easily there. And this is what we're doing today is very much an experimental first attempt to do this. Something I've thought about for a lot of years, but it's the idea. And then the second thing that's really important here is that the people who are playing here are volunteers, people on Hornby, and they're just learning how to do this. And to a large extent, they've created their version of the piece. So it's not really me doing this. I've shown their kind of little sections in it, but they have created it as a performance for you, working with the string quartet. And we will have the instruments on display here after the concert, and so you can try them out. They're made of ceramic. They are very delicate. And I think that that's a wonderful symbol of the fragility of our natural world right at this moment when death as a super species dominates the whole planet to an extent that we are largely unconscious of. But my aim in this piece is to actually reanimate our deeper connections to nature that are really very ancient, but they're still inside of us. Even the very fact that if you hear a sound and your head turns to it, that's a really ancient thing inside of yourself that orients towards the sound. And just one final thing, there's going to be a festival in a few years' time in Victoria, which is about Gaia and it's about our relationship to nature. It's being organized by John O'Riordan. And if you want to find out about it, it's at climateofthearts.org, and you can find out about this festival that's being planned and being developed over the next few years to reconnect ourselves to what's going on in the natural world.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, you mentioned that you want people to listen to nature with musical ears. Yes. And one of the things that I think is really significant about the work in the Sculpture Park is that the sculpture is not on pedestals; it's embedded, and actually, in some cases, bolted into the Sculpture Park itself. And it now invites the viewer to contemplate these pieces of human creativity in the context of this incredibly beautiful natural landscape. I wonder if you could elaborate perhaps on the analogies between that approach to art and what you've created today.
Well, in terms of my time in the Sculpture Park, I found very often I'd be with Jeffrey's sculptures, and then I'd be sort of standing back and actually listening to the Sculpture Park. And I found as the longer I was here, that relationship between what I listened to and what I saw and what I felt in the park, and the very much the feeling of the man-made and the natural interacting was very important. I actually tried to photograph them that way as well, so that you saw the relationship between the two. And I think that people who are at the Sculpture Park feel that very, very powerfully. And I wonder whether in some ways one of the effects of the Sculpture Park is to make people actually become sort of sensitively aware of the natural world a little more. I think that
the aestheticization of nature was definitely a goal, and being able to see both human creativity as on par with or approaching the beauty and creativity that's exhibited in nature is an incredibly important move for Jeffrey. It was one of the things that he wanted. He wanted people to feel this sense of hopefulness that humans had this degree of creativity that could approach a nature and thereby value themselves not as a disease or some sort of aberration, but as a really important part of nature.
I think the position that we're in right now is extremely complex, and I think we're just in a kind of process of waking up and growing up about who we are. And I think that the artists have a real role to play in that waking up awareness of our extraordinary selves as a species and our amazing potential.
Well, Paul, we had the pleasure of hearing you at our recent forum on art and the sacred. And I'm wondering how, when you were composing this piece, how it might have related to that theme. I know you had a presentation at that forum.
The way the piece, if you listen to the work, it starts low and it builds up higher. And well, there's a lot of passion in it, but these moments where you feel like you're suspended in a higher realm, and I actually am trying to kind of connect lower and higher together with the music, and you can hear in the lines, you can hear these things, and you'll actually hear moments where it's just sort of right up in another place, and at the same time you're going to hear incredible lows too, and there's a really big contrast between these two things, and I feel that I don't always know consciously what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. And there's sometimes I put things in and I go, I have no idea why I'm doing this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I feel this is related to something in terms of my spiritual feelings that are almost unconscious, and they just come out when I'm writing.
We called this series the Masters of Counterpoint concert series. Jeffrey's work was, in his view, a solid, three-dimensional plastic version of the same aesthetic approach to composition as music. So he had this parallel of, sculpture is actually music in a plastic form, and music is actually sculpture in an elastic medium. Counterpoint. So counterpoint is, if you're not aware of it, is a form of composition where you have multiple musical lines. It's a form of polyphony, and what I wonder is, the string quartet is inherently polyphonic, right? There's many voices happening at the same time. Can you explain how polyphony and counterpoint factored into your composition?
Well, if you listen to the lines, if you right at the beginning of it, you'll hear this kind of what I call a chorale at the beginning, played by the lower three instruments in harmony. And then there's a melody that's being played by the first violin, and there's a kind of interplay of meaning between these two parts, and you'll listen to the violin, and then you'll hear to the lower parts will actually express something that's very related to it. And sometimes in the music too, I have a tendency to kind of to have multiple kind of feelings at the same time in the music, which is very much a contrapuntal kind of thing, but I'm not using really formal things like a fugue or these sort of things that often people admire the older composers for in that kind of style. What I'm trying to do is create these different voices and how they interplay, and often what they do is they express a different feeling in each voice, a different consciousness. So that's...
A dog or a bird?
Okay, so that's the way my counterpoint often works. Also, like I use the term in-betweening for counterpoint often. There's a lot of sort of kind of effective harmony. It's very harmonic, my music. It's very melodic. But often there's this kind of interplay between this part and then this part, this part, then this part, this part, then this part. And I use the term in-betweening for that.
I want to address one of the things that you said. You have sort of three maxims. One of them is the audience is important. We've got a wonderful audience here today. I'm just wondering, you've got an experiment running today. What does that say about what you think of the form, the classical music form, and what you're trying to do here today? There's obviously something different.
Well, actually, one of the things that in theater, you have a thing called the fourth wall. The fourth wall is the audience. And what I like to do is break that wall, as very few, it sometimes happens in theater. So we have our wonderful volunteers who've largely created their own version of this piece. And at a certain point, I just let them kind of do that in a very beautiful way. And so you're going to have an interaction between people who are really members of the audience, members of the public, and then the professionals, the so-called professional thing. And I believe that we're all really super musical. And these instruments from Peru are an amazing opportunity to kind of like connect in a really interesting and actually, I think, quite safe way with music at another realm. And I'd be really interested to know the volunteers who are playing these things. I want to know all their reactions to it and all their experiences and things like that. I'd like to see this blown up something much bigger where many, many, many people can use these instruments, and we can kind of, I don't know where it's going to ultimately go. But we're trying this experiment today, and I think we will go into more steps in the future.
So all of you are part of our experiment today, and you're welcome to give us feedback.
Yes.
I think we're going to start. We've been very patient. So I'd like to first of all thank Paul Alexander for his wonderful work.
And I would like to thank Karun for his wonderful work, because he's amazing to work with, and I think Karun is great.
Oh, thank
Okay.
you. Thank you. Well,